My son had the locks changed on my bakery the morning after I buried my wife. I found out standing in the parking lot at 5 in the morning, key in hand, rain coming down, unable to get inside the place I had built with 41 years of my own sweat. That same afternoon I made one phone call, and everything my son thought he owned began to disappear. My name is Harold Sutton. I am 67 years old. And what I am about to tell you is the most painful thing I've ever lived through, and the most necessary. My wife Dorothy and I opened Sutton's Bakery in Millfield, Ohio, in September of 1983. We were 26 years old. We had $400, a second-hand commercial oven, and a lease on a storefront that smelled like motor oil from whatever business had been there before. Dorothy scrubbed that floor on her hands and knees for 3 days before she let a single customer walk through the door. She had a rule about that. If your name is on the sign, your hands go on the floor first. We made bread. We made pies. We made the kind of cinnamon rolls that people drove 45 minutes for on Saturday mornings. Dorothy handled the baking. I handled the accounts and the suppliers and the expansion. By 1995, we had 3 locations. By 2005, we had 9. We employed over 200 people across central Ohio, many of them families who had worked with us for a decade or more. We were not millionaires in the way people imagine millionaires. But we had built something real, something that fed people and employed people and had our name on it. That meant everything to us. Our son was born in 1985. We named him after Dorothy's father, a man who worked the steel mills his whole life and never asked anyone for a single thing. We raised our son the same way. He grew up in the bakery, doing dishes on weekends, stocking shelves after school, learning the business the way we had learned it, from the floor up. He was a good boy. That is the part that makes this so hard to talk about. He was a genuinely good boy. He used to bring leftover bread to the elderly woman next door, without being asked. He wrote Dorothy a poem for her 40th birthday that she kept folded in her wallet until the day she died. He changed when he married his wife. I will not spend too long on her, because she does not deserve the time. But you need to understand what happened, to understand everything else. She came from a family that believed comfort was a birthright. She looked at everything we had built and saw something she wanted to possess, not something she admired. Within 2 years of their marriage, my son stopped showing up for Saturday morning inventory. He stopped joining us for the supplier meetings he had always attended. He started referring to the bakery as the family business in a way that emphasized the word family, as if to remind us that he was in that family, that he had a claim on it. Dorothy noticed before I did. She always noticed before I did. Harold, she told me one night, our son is being reshaped by that woman, and he does not even see it happening. I told her she was being a worried mother. I told her he was happy, and that was what mattered. I was wrong, and I think some part of me knew I was wrong even then, but I loved my son and I did not want to see it. In January 2020, Dorothy was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Stage 3. The oncologist at Ohio State was honest with us in the way you do not really appreciate until later. He told us that with aggressive treatment we had a real fight on our hands. That was the word he used. Fight. Dorothy looked at him and said, "Good, I have been fighting my whole life." I called our son that same evening. He answered on the 3rd ring. He was at a restaurant with his wife. I could hear the background noise. I told him about his mother. He said he was sorry. He said they would come by that weekend. He said, "Let me know if you need anything." And then he asked whether Dorothy had updated her will recently. He asked that question the same night I told him his mother had cancer. I stayed silent for so long that he cleared his throat and said, "Dad, I just want to make sure things are in order for you both." I said goodnight and I hung up. They did come that weekend. His wife sat in our living room looking at the furniture, the way an appraiser looks at things, taking inventory. She asked Dorothy how she was feeling with a kind of clinical efficiency that had nothing behind it. Our son spent most of the visit on his phone. They left after 90 minutes. Dorothy watched their car pull out of the driveway, and then she took my hand and said, "I want us to talk to George." George was our attorney. George Parrish. He had handled every contract and every lease and every business agreement we had made for 22 years. We trusted him the way you trust someone who has watched your whole life be built. We met with George the following week, and Dorothy was the one who did most of the talking. She told him what she was afraid of. She told him what she was afraid of. She told him what she had seen in our son, in his wife, in the way they looked at things. She told him she wanted to protect what we had built, not from taxes or creditors, but from the people she was most afraid would get their hands on it after she was gone. I sat there listening to my wife plan for a future in which she would not exist, and it was one of the hardest hours of my life. George asked questions. He took notes. He told us he had handled situations like this before, and that there were ways to structure things so that the bakery and the properties and the real assets we had built were protected inside a trust that our son would not be able to access or alter without our consent. He called it a revocable living trust with a private protector clause. I called it Dorothy's insurance policy. We signed the documents in February 2020. Our son knew nothing about it. The treatment was hard. Chemotherapy took Dorothy's hair, her energy, 31 pounds off her frame. But it did not take her spirit. She still came into the bakery on Saturday mornings when she felt well enough. She still tasted every new recipe before it went into production. She still knew the names of every employee and their children's names and what was going on in their lives. Our son came by less and less. His wife stopped coming entirely, citing something about her health, something vague that she never specified. When I called him and told him his mother was asking for him, he said he was dealing with some work pressures, that he would come when things settled down. Things never seemed to settle down. One afternoon in the spring of 2021, Dorothy asked me to take her for a drive. She wanted to see all 9 bakery locations. We drove to every one of them, parked outside, sat in the car while she looked at the buildings with that particular expression she had when she was making something permanent in her memory. "Harold," she said when we were parked outside the original location in Millfield, "whatever happens, do not let anyone take this from the people who actually built it." I told her nothing was going to happen to anything. She gave me a look that I had learned over 40 years to take seriously. Dorothy passed away on a Wednesday morning in October 2021. I was sitting beside her. Her last words were to tell our son she loved him. She said it without bitterness, which I think says everything you need to know about who she was. I called our son immediately. He did not answer. I left a voicemail. He called back 40 minutes later. He said he would make arrangements. He took over the funeral planning the same day. He called the funeral home before I did. He contacted Dorothy's family members before I could. When I arrived at the funeral home the following morning to discuss the arrangements, the director told me that my son had already been in and had made most of the decisions. The flowers Dorothy had asked for specifically, simple white gardenias, had been changed to formal lilies because his wife thought they were more appropriate for a service of this significance. I stood in that office and I felt something turn cold in my chest. Not sadness. Something else. The day of Dorothy's memorial service, our son stood at the door of the reception hall greeting people as if he were the host of the event. His wife wore a dress that cost more than our first commercial oven. When I arrived and moved to stand beside our son to receive guests, he touched my arm gently and told me that they had it covered, that I should go sit and rest, that I had been through a lot. I looked at him for a long moment, then I found a seat and I sat in it, and I watched my son perform grief for 2 hours in front of everyone who had known Dorothy their whole lives. The people from the bakery were there, employees who had worked for us for 15 years, 20 years. They hugged me and cried and told me she was one of a kind. Our son shook their hands at the door and thanked them for coming, as if he were thanking vendors for attending a business lunch. That evening, after everyone had gone, our son sat down with me in the living room of the house Dorothy and I had shared for 38 years. His wife sat beside him. There was a man with them I did not recognize, a younger man in an expensive suit who was introduced to me as their financial advisor. "Dad," our son said, "I know this isn't the timing any of us would choose, but we need to talk about the business." I said nothing. I let him continue. He talked for about 20 minutes, about efficiency and modernization and bringing in outside management and restructuring the ownership to prepare for growth. His wife added things occasionally, small editorial comments about vision and potential. The financial advisor had a folder. At the end of it, our son slid a set of documents across the coffee table toward me. These would formalize the transition, he said. It protects you, Dad. You would have a consulting role. You would still be part of the business. Consulting role. In the bakery Dorothy and I had built from one borrowed oven and $400. I looked at the documents. They were dense, 40 pages at least, full of language that would take a week to understand properly. Our son's pen was already out, held toward me across the table like an offering. Just initial each page and sign the last one, he said. We can handle the details from there. I thought about Dorothy sitting in George Parrish's office. I thought about the documents we had already signed. I thought about the word insurance. I put the pen down without touching the documents. I said I was tired and asked them to leave. His wife's expression did not change. She had practiced a blank expression, I realized. She had practiced it for exactly this kind of moment. Our son said, "Of course, Dad, take all the time you need," and they gathered up their folder and left. I sat alone in the house for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called George. The next morning at 5 in the morning, which is the time I have woken up my entire adult life, because that is when bakers wake up, I drove to our original location in Millfield. I parked in the lot and walked to the back door, the one I have used every morning for 40 years. My key did not work. I tried it twice. I tried the front door. I walked around the building trying every entrance. The locks had been changed on every door, all of them. Overnight, I stood in the parking lot in the early morning rain, holding a key that had opened that door thousands of times, and I understood that our son had not waited for me to sign anything. He'd already decided I was done. I sat in my truck for a while. I am not going to pretend I did not feel what I felt sitting there. I am 67 years old. I buried my wife 4 days earlier, and I was standing in the rain outside a building I had built with my hands, locked out of it by my own son. But Dorothy's voice was in my head. Whatever happens, do not let anyone take this from the people who actually built it. I picked up my phone and called George Parrish. "George," I said, "it is time." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been waiting for your call, Harold. I have everything ready. Give me until 9. What our son did not know, what he had never bothered to find out because he was too busy planning a transition he assumed I was too old and too sad to prevent, was that the bakery he thought he was inheriting did not belong to him. It had never belonged to him. It belonged to a trust. The Sutton Family Legacy Trust, established February 2020, was George Parrish as trustee and myself as the sole living beneficiary was controlling authority. The 9 bakery locations, the real estate under 7 of them, the commercial equipment, the supplier contracts, the name Sutton's Bakery, all of it was inside that trust. Our son had no legal relationship to any of it. The documents he had tried to get me to sign would have given him operating authority over a few bank accounts. That was all. He did not understand what he was reaching for because he had never done the work to understand the business he wanted to take. George filed the trustee notifications with every landlord, every supplier, every bank by noon that day. By 3 o'clock, our son's calls started coming in. First 1, then 3, then 7 within the hour. I did not answer. His wife called from her number. I did not answer. His wife called from her number. I did not answer. He left voicemails. The first one was calm and businesslike, explaining that there must have been a misunderstanding. The second was less calm. By the 5th one, his voice had changed entirely. He sounded like a boy who had broken something and was beginning to understand how much trouble he was actually in. On the 4th day, after Dorothy's service, I met with my management team at the Millfield location. I had a locksmith let me in. Every key in our son's possession had been canceled. Every access code he had ever known had been changed. I sat in the back office with the 9 managers who ran our locations, and I told them what had happened. Not because they needed to know the family details, but because they deserved honesty. They had built this with us. They had a right to know it was safe. The head baker at our Columbus location, a woman who had worked with Dorothy for 17 years, cried when I told her the trust was intact. She said, "I was so scared, Harold. We all were. We heard things." I asked her what things she had heard. She said our son had been calling the location managers directly for the past 2 months. He had been telling them that I was planning to sell the business, that changes were coming, that they should be prepared to report to new ownership. He had been laying the groundwork quietly while Dorothy was still sick. He had started planning this while his mother was still alive. I stayed very still when she told me that. Then I thanked her, and I told her nothing was going to change, that every employee's job was safe, that Sutton's Bakery would still be there when her grandchildren were old enough to eat cinnamon rolls on Saturday mornings. Our son eventually reached me by showing up at the house. He knocked for 15 minutes before I opened the door. He looked different. The expensive suit was gone. He looked like someone who had not slept. His wife was not with him. He asked me to explain what was happening with the bank accounts and the suppliers. I told him very simply. I told him that Dorothy and I had planned for this possibility 2 years ago, that everything he thought he was going to take was protected inside a trust he had no claim on, that the documents he had tried to get me to sign would have given him exactly nothing because the real assets were never in his reach to begin with. He stood on my porch and I watched him understand it, really understand it, all at once. The calculations he had made, the timing, the locksmith, the phone calls to my managers, everything he had set in motion while his mother was dying, none of it had worked. Not a single piece of it. He said, "Dad, I can explain." He said his wife had pushed him. He said he had been scared about what would happen to the business when I was gone. He said he was trying to protect it. I looked at my son for a long time. I thought about Dorothy asking me every few weeks in the last year of her life whether he had called. I thought about the night she lay awake, not from pain, but from the particular grief of a mother who knows her child has become someone she does not recognize. I told him the truth. I said, "I believe you were scared. I believe she pushed you. And I believe she pushed you. And I believe you let her. That is on you, not her." He asked what would happen to his inheritance. I told him that Dorothy and I had made our decision about that a long time ago, that the trust had specific instructions, that when I was gone, the properties and the business and the majority of the assets would transfer to an endowment we had already established in Dorothy's name, supporting vocational training programs for young people who wanted to work in the food industry, people who had the drive but not the resources. The bakery itself would be transitioned to employee ownership, with the management team we had built over decades given first right to purchase at below market rates. Our son received a specific inheritance. One thing, the original recipe notebook Dorothy had used since 1983. Every recipe in her handwriting, every note in the margins, every small adjustment she had made over 40 years of baking. I had it wrapped and sent to him by courier the following week. I included a note for myself. It said, "Your mother wanted you to have this. I hope one day you understand what it is worth." He called me when he received it. He did not say anything at first. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Dad, I am sorry." I said, "I know you are." I said nothing else and we ended the call. That was 14 months ago. I still run the bakery. I am at the Millfield location every Saturday morning at 5 o'clock. Sometimes I think I can still smell Dorothy's perfume in the back room where she used to check the bread before we opened. Though I know that is just memory, doing what memory does. The Dorothy Sutton Vocational Endowment has funded training for 63 young people in its first year: bakers, pastry chefs, culinary managers. Kids who work hard and needed someone to believe the work was worth investing in. We held a small ceremony last month at the original location. Some of the kids brought their parents. One of them, a 19-year-old from Columbus who had been working 2 jobs to save enough for culinary school, shook my hand and said she had never thought something like this could happen for someone like her. Dorothy would have loved that. She would have memorized that girl's name and asked about her every single week until she graduated. I do not know where my son is right now, not exactly. I hear things through people we both know, that his wife left after the money situation became clear, that he is working somewhere in Cleveland, that he is doing okay. I hope he is doing okay. He is my son, and I hope that for him the way I hope it for myself. But some things do not go back to what they were, and I made my peace with that a long time ago, not the day George filed the trust notifications, Not even the morning I stood in the rain outside my own bakery. I made my peace with it. The afternoon Dorothy and I sat in our truck outside the original location, and she memorized the building with her eyes and held my hand and did not say another word for the rest of the drive home. She already knew. She was already saying goodbye to the idea of a son who might do the right thing on his own. She was already choosing, with the time she had left, to put her love somewhere it would last. Every loaf of bread that comes out of our ovens has her name behind it. Every young person who gets a scholarship from that endowment carries something of hers forward without knowing it. Every Saturday morning when the smell of cinnamon rolls moves through the streets of Millfield, that is Dorothy Sutton, still showing up, still doing the work, still refusing to let anyone take away what she built. If this story means something to you, if it sounds like something you have lived or something you are afraid of living, leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I read every one. Like this, if you believe that what we build with our hands and our love deserves to outlast the people who try to take it from us. And subscribe, because every week I share another story of ordinary people facing extraordinary moments and finding out what they are really made of. People ask me sometimes whether I regret the way things ended with my son. They mean well when they ask. They want to hear that I softened, that we reconciled, that the story has a warmer ending than it does. I understand that. People want things to resolve cleanly, but here is what I have learned at 67, standing on the other side of the hardest year of my life. The choices we make when we think no one is watching, or when we think the other person is too old or too grieving to fight back. Those choices are not separate from who we are. They are exactly who we are. My son did not become someone different the week Dorothy died. He became visible. There is a difference. Dorothy used to say that the character of a person shows up most clearly under pressure, not because pressure changes people, but because it removes the effort people make to appear better than they are. She was right about that, the way she was right about most things. And I watched it happen in real time, watched my son stop making that effort the moment he thought the pressure was entirely in his favor. What he did not account for was that Dorothy and I had been watching for years. We had not been naive. We had been patient, and patient is not the same thing as unprepared. The lesson I keep coming back to is not about revenge. I want to be clear about that. What George and I set in motion was not revenge. It was consequence. There is a difference between those two things as well. Revenge is something you choose in the heat of pain. Consequence is something that was already there, already built into the structure of the choices a person made, waiting to become real. My son reached for something that was never his, using methods that were dishonest at a moment he calculated I would be too broken to respond. The consequence was simply that none of it worked. That is not something I did to him. That is something I did to him. That is something he did to himself. What I think about most now is not the morning I stood in the rain outside my own bakery. It is the afternoon Dorothy and I sat with George Parrish and she did the talking. She was already sick. She was already sick. She was already tired in that deep way. That illness makes you tired. But her mind was sharp and her purpose was completely clear. She was protecting something she had spent her life building, and she was doing it with intelligence and foresight and total calm. That is the image I carry. Not my son's face when he understood what he had lost. Dorothy's face when she decided what she was going to do about it. That is what I want anyone watching this to take away. Not that the bad guy lost, not that justice arrived on schedule, but that Dorothy's response to fear was not paralysis. It was preparation. She could not control what our son would become. She could not control grief or greed or the particular kind of ambition that makes a person willing to hurt their own family. What she could control was what she built while she still had time. So she built it carefully, quietly, with the same hands that had been building things since 1983. There is no age at which it is too late to do that. There is no loss so complete that it removes your ability to act with integrity and forethought. Harold Sutton did not win because he was smarter than his son, or luckier, or better connected. He held on because Dorothy Sutton had the wisdom to plan for the worst while still hoping for the best, and the character to do it without bitterness, without cruelty, with nothing but love for what she had built and clarity about what it deserved. that is worth more than any inheritance. And it lasts longer than any of us.